Hello again, and welcome to our Mercy Conversations, where we get to share a little bit of Scripture together, where we get to share conversation about what Scripture is saying to us in a larger, wider, more vast space here on the internet. And we also get to share some of the conversations that we experienced in our Sunday worship. And this Sunday, the scripture that we read together and discussed comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, and begins with verse 23. So let's listen as a group and see where the scriptures are leading us, see what they might be speaking to us now and in this space. Let us listen for a word from God. When Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and elders of the people came to him as he was teaching. They asked, "What kind of authority do you have for doing these things? Who gave you this authority?" Jesus replied, "I have a question for you. If you tell me the answer, I'll tell you what kind of authority I have to do these things. Where did John get his authority to baptize? Did he get it from heaven or from humans?" They argued amongst themselves, "If we say from heaven, he'll say to us, 'Then why didn't you believe him?' But we can't say from humans because we're afraid of the crowd, since everyone thinks John was a prophet." They replied, "We don't know." Jesus also said to them, "Neither will I tell you what kind of authority I have to do these things. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He came to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' 'No, I don't want to,' he replied. But later he changed his mind and went. The father said the same thing to the other son, who replied, 'Yes, sir,' but he didn't go. Which one of these 2 did the father's will?" They said, "The first one." Jesus said to them, "I assure you that the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering God's kingdom ahead of you. For John came to you on the righteous road, and you didn't believe him. But tax collectors and prostitutes believed him. Yet after you saw this, you didn't change your hearts and lives, and you didn't believe him." These are God's words for God's people. Thanks be to God. So a little bit of context before we dive into our conversation. In this chapter, particularly in Matthew, Jesus' authority being questioned by the chief priests is directly following his entering back into Jerusalem on a donkey, our Palm Sunday passage, and in the piece of Jesus cleaning the temple, of him cleansing the temple, of overturning tables, of challenging some of the inappropriate things that they were doing in the temple. And so the chief priests are directly responding to this by asking, "What authority do you have to do these things? Why are you calling yourself a prophet? Why are people calling you Messiah?" And particularly as we see the conversation between Jesus and the chief priests referring to John the Baptist and using the language of prophet, of one who would have been ordained and had hands laid on him. And so they're very concerned. They're questioning Jesus' authority, but they're also trying to trap him, which is something that we discussed a little bit in our conversation, and is important as we think about the context from which we're experiencing right now in this text. And so one of the first beautiful comments we received was one of our gentlemen identifying that in this parable, Jesus uses tax collectors and prostitutes as a reminder of these individuals being the ones who get it. These are the ones who believe when they saw Jesus. They got who Jesus was and got why Jesus was there. That they felt this power and presence of this man in a way that was real and tangible. Versus some of us really struggle to understand and to see that. And we all do at some point, I believe, in our lives. And yet we were struck in our conversation that the most marginalized, most ignored, most scoffed at groups of people were the ones that Jesus says, they get it. They understand. You who are the most educated are the ones who are missing the mark, who are missing the point. And again, it's not so much an us versus them, but it was this beautiful recognition of who gets it, who sees. That we often forget the beauty of those who, and the wisdom of those who are marginalized and neglected and often overshadowed. So that was a really beautiful point. We also talked about the conversation between the Pharisees and Jesus, and this notion of authority, this notion of, as we mentioned in our context giving just a few moments ago, one of our members also mentioned that they're not only setting Jesus up, but that in such a way as to their questioning is not sincere. It's a power play. They're concerned about their own power and their own privilege and what would happen, rather than really being concerned about who John was and wondering if John really was given authority from humans or from heaven. And so this understanding, this awareness of the power dynamics that were at play, that it wasn't about really discovering, really having a curiosity for John, for Jesus, and the authority that comes from all of that, but a power play of, if you're claiming, and he's claiming, to have this divine, heavenly authority, then that takes away my own authority, my power, my privilege. And so the dynamics there between this human authority, as we continued in our conversation, of being a raw power, of being something that we're always fighting for, almost to this tension of tug of war, of saying, I'm going to force my power, I'm going to use force for you to acknowledge me as somebody of power, versus this divine authority for John and for Jesus that speaks of truth. That again, as we saw in our community, one of our beloved community members noted justice. And we've talked about justice. We talked about that in the past, and how this beautiful shift, this beautiful dynamism in the difference between human authority, which is this sense of raw power, and this divine authority that speaks to truth, that speaks to life, that it encourages us to live a life that speaks of really loving one another. As we moved back into our conversation, we talked about what our actions and our actions being the mirror of our hearts, much like we see with the first son, who originally says, no, I don't want to, but later changed his mind. And then we see the second son who's got the zeal and the enthusiasm and says, yes, I'm going to go. And we often have this enthusiasm. Yes, I'm going to go, Jesus, whatever you need me to do. Yes, I'm going to love the poor and impoverished, and I'm going to be on fire for recovery. I'm going to be on fire for health and well-being of myself and for those around me. And then the rubber meets the road and we're like, not quite ready for that. And so we think about how that truth, that inner awareness in ourselves, speaks to what is it in my life that is motivating me? Am I motivated by this need for power and to be right? Or am I motivated by this sense of truth, of justice, of love and grace and peace? Are those the things that are going to pour out from me onto those around me? And so we had some really, really beautiful conversations, and I hope that this has inspired you and encouraged you as we continue to ponder this text, as we continue to ponder this idea of a shift of power, of where power comes from, of what power and justice look like, and what it looks like to continue to be inspired to live out faithfully our own wellness, our own wholeness, and where that comes from. That comes from a divine being, not from humans. But because God's great love for us shines upon us, even the most broken and impoverished and powerless people, that God's love pours out upon us, and that can be shared as well. So, beloved community, I pray that this text, that this conversation has blessed you, and that will encourage you, and that you might be encouraged to encourage others. Thanks for joining us.